to look at what's meant by voluntary. I know at first blush, voluntary and compulsory seem to be perfectly straightforward, simple expressions opposite the one to the other. But let me just ask one question. Suppose it were decided that those who had dependents still abroad could not claim tax relief on their behalf. Now, no doubt, that change, an administrative change which would bring our tax law into line with that of many other countries, would greatly stimulate the propensity to accept assistance with repatriation. Persuasion. I see. So you regard that as voluntary?
Persuasion.
I see. So that's voluntary. You class that as voluntary?
Persuasion or intimidation?
Well, you tell me. I want to know what you mean by voluntary. And I've given you an example of a government policy which would undoubtedly increase the propensity to accept assisted repatriation. Now, is that to be classed as voluntary repatriation?
No, I would term that as an inducement to accept.
And you regard that as voluntary? No. You asked me whether I have in mind voluntary or compulsory. And therefore I must know what it is that you regard as voluntary. Now I want you to tell me whether that would be voluntary repatriation.
No, I would think that would be intimidation.
Oh, I see. So, any policy which does not place every inducement before those who are here to remain here is, in your opinion, compulsory repatriation.
Well, what is your motivation for bringing in such legislation? Why are you suggesting that should happen?
I'm suggesting it because if it is public policy that in order to avert evils which threaten all, including the immigrants, the prospective future size of the immigrant population shall be reduced, then the government would, in such matters as taxation, naturally and logically behave not on the assumption that this is a population permanently domiciled here, but that it is a population only temporarily domiciled here. And I gave you an example of it. And therefore, I'm pointing out that to talk about voluntary and compulsory as though they were single alternatives, monolithic alternatives, is nonsense.
Can I then ask you why anyone...
You've gone off that then.
Well, if you wish to continue with the discussion,
yes, I see.
How would you define compulsory? You see,
well,
I'm wondering.
Compulsory in the sense in which this term is used, I'm sure, but the sense which it conveys to the general public is that a person would be physically seized and deported, like a person being taken on board Majesty's ships of war at the end of the 18th century.
So where would you draw the line, Mr. Powell?
I draw it short of that.
How far short?
But we have to remember that on the other side, there is the alternative. We have to remember that we are making a choice of necessities. A choice, if you like, of evils. This country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
It's a speech which, 50 years on, still rears its head when the topic of immigration is raised. On the 20th of April 1968, the Conservative MP Enoch Powell spoke against mass immigration at the party's political centre in Birmingham, in what is known as the Rivers of Blood speech. The speech was critical of the Race Relations Bill, which later that year became an Act of Parliament. The new legislation made it illegal to refuse housing, employment and public services to people on the basis of race. Powell believed it would be used to discriminate against the established white population. Reaction to the speech was swift, with party leader Edward Heath removing Powell from his post as Shadow Defence Secretary, citing the speech's inflammatory nature and the risk of damage to race relations.
It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
However, Powell's sentiments were shared by many voters, and the speech is believed to have been a decisive factor in the Conservatives' 1970 general election victory. Only 4 years later, the Wolverhampton MP had left the party in protest at the government's decision to take Britain into the then European Economic Community.